The flour tin lid came off with a squeak that had become familiar, but the sight of folded bills tucked beneath the white powder still sent a jolt through Helena Lawson's chest like a horse kick she never saw coming. 3 times now in as many weeks, and each discovery left her standing in the back room of her failing bakery with her heart hammering and her pride stinging in equal measure, wondering who thought her so pitiful that she needed anonymous charity slipped into her supplies like coins for a beggar's cup. She dusted the flour from the bills with trembling fingers, counting $12 this time, enough to pay the grain supplier and keep the ovens burning another month, and the gratitude that rose in her throat tasted like ash mixed with something sweeter she refused to name. The bakery sat on the corner of Main Street and 2nd in Ogallala, Nebraska, a prairie town that sprawled along the Union Pacific line like a drunk sleeping off a bender, all false fronts and ambitious dirt. Helena had opened the shop 2 years ago in 1877, with money saved from working in her late aunt's boarding house in Omaha, convinced that hard work and decent bread would be enough to carve out a life of her own. She was 24 now, and learning the bitter lesson that effort alone bought nothing when the railroad brought cheaper goods from the east and half the town preferred the convenience of crackers from a barrel to her sourdough loaves. The shop was clean, the shelves lined with what little inventory she could afford, and the front window showed the street in wavy glass that made passing riders look like ghosts. She lived in the 2 rooms behind the shop, waking before dawn to fire the ovens and going to bed with flour in her hair and the smell of yeast in every thread she owned. The money had appeared first 3 weeks ago, tucked into the flour tin she kept on the high shelf where the light from the window would not spoil it. She had thought it a mistake at first, perhaps bills that fell from her own pocket, except she knew to the penny what she had, and this was not hers. The second time, she had checked the lock on the back door and found it untouched, the bolt still thrown from the inside where she had left it the night before. Someone was coming in through the front during business hours, slipping past her while she worked in the back or served the occasional customer, and that narrowed the field considerably because Ogallala was not a town full of subtle people. Zachary Morrison came in every morning just after sunrise, his boots announcing him on the plank walkway before the bell above the door had a chance to jingle. He was a tall man gone leaner still, all bone and tendon and sun-browned skin stretched tight over a frame that looked like it had forgotten what softness felt like. His face was a landscape of hard angles, cheekbones sharp enough to cut, and a jaw that seemed locked in permanent clench, and his eyes were the pale gray blue of a winter sky that promised snow but never delivered. He wore his hat low, and his words even lower, speaking only to ask for 2 loaves of bread, always the sourdough, and counting his coins onto the counter with the careful precision of a man who knew what it meant to be short. He had been coming in since she opened, as regular as clockwork and just as talkative, and in 2 years she had learned almost nothing about him except that he worked the cattle drives north from Texas and stayed through winter at the Circle J Ranch 10 miles west of town. She had never paid him much attention beyond the routine of the transaction, another weathered cowboy in a town full of them, until the money started appearing, and she began watching her customers with new suspicion. He came in this morning as always, the sun barely clearing the horizon and painting the street in shades of rose and gold that would burn off to white heat by noon. Helena was at the counter, the $12 now tucked into her apron pocket where they seemed to weigh more than paper had any right to weigh, and when he stepped through the door, she looked at him with eyes sharpened by 3 weeks of mystery. He stopped just inside, his hand still on the door, and something flickered across his face, too quick to catch, but impossible to miss. Guilt, raw and obvious as a fresh brand, followed by a terrible attempt to smooth his expression into something neutral that only made him look more guilty. His eyes went to the floor, then the ceiling, then finally landed somewhere around her left shoulder, refusing to meet her gaze while a muscle jumped in his jaw. She had played enough poker in her aunt's boarding house to recognize a man holding a losing hand, and Zachary Morrison's face was a confession written in a language anyone could read. "Morning," he said, his voice rough as gravel under wagon wheels. "2 loaves, please." She did not move to get the bread. Instead, she stood there, her hands flat on the counter between them, and watched the guilt spread across his face like spilled ink. His hat brim dipped lower. His weight shifted from one foot to the other. His fingers flexed at his sides like they wanted something to hold on to, and the silence stretched between them until it felt like a living thing. "I found money again," Helena said finally, keeping her voice level and her eyes on his face. "In my flour tin." The guilt intensified, if such a thing were possible. He looked like a man caught with his hand in the church collection plate, except instead of shame, there was something almost desperate in the set of his shoulders. "That's so," he said, not a question, and his poker face was so catastrophically bad that she almost felt sorry for him. "3rd time this month," she continued, each word placed with care. $12 today, 20 the time before, 15 before that." "Huh." He examined the floorboards as if they contained answers. "Strange. Very strange." She leaned forward slightly, trying to catch his eye, but he studied the counter with fierce intensity. "You would not happen to know anything about it, would you, Mr. Morrison?" His throat worked in a swallow. The muscle in his jaw jumped again. He opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. "No," he said, and a child of 5 could have called the lie. "Nothing about it. Maybe you got a secret admirer or such." The absurdity of it might have made her laugh if she were not so tangled up in pride and confusion, and something else she could not name. "A secret admirer who breaks into my shop to hide money in my flour. People do strange things." He was still looking anywhere but at her, his face a storm of tells. "Might be someone just wants to help. I do not need help." The words came out sharper than she intended, edged with the pride that had kept her spine straight through 2 years of slow failure. "I have managed on my own since I opened this shop, and I will continue to manage." Something changed in his expression then, a flicker of pain that cut through the guilt and landed somewhere deeper. He finally looked at her, really looked, and his pale eyes held a weight that made her breath catch. "I know you do not," he said quietly. "You are about the most capable person I ever met, but maybe someone just wants to anyway." The admission hung in the air between them, not quite a confession but close enough that her heart started beating faster. She thought of him coming in every morning for 2 years, buying bread he probably did not need in quantities that seemed excessive for one man, counting out his coins while watching her with those winter sky eyes. She thought of the care with which the bills had been folded and placed, tucked deep enough to be safe but shallow enough to be found, and the amount always enough to matter but not so much as to insult. This was not random charity. This was specific, personal, and aimed with a precision that spoke of attention paid and needs observed. "Why?" The question came out softer than she meant, almost vulnerable, and she hated the sound of it. Why would someone do that? He looked at her for a long moment, his face cycling through a dozen expressions he could not quite hide, and she saw him struggle with words that clearly did not come easy. His hands flexed again at his sides. His jaw worked. Finally, he just shook his head, a small, defeated movement. "Can I have my bread, please?" he asked instead, and the deflection was answer enough. She got him the loaves, wrapped them in brown paper with hands that felt clumsy, and when he paid she noticed his fingers trembled slightly as he counted the coins. He took the bread and turned to go, moving toward the door with the stiff gait of a man retreating from a battlefield, and something in her chest pulled tight. He was at the threshold when she spoke again. "Mr. Morrison." He stopped, did not turn around. "Thank you," she said, the words scraping her pride raw. "For the bread money, I mean, for whatever you know about it." His shoulders tensed under his worn shirt. For a moment she thought he might turn, might finally say whatever was locked behind his terrible poker face. But instead, he just nodded once and stepped out into the morning sun. The door swung shut behind him with a gentle click, and Helena was left standing in her empty shop with a pocket full of mysterious money, and a heart that felt like it was trying to figure out something her head had not caught up to yet. She did not sleep well that night, lying in her narrow bed behind the shop and listening to the sounds of Ogallala settling down for the evening. Somewhere a dog barked. Horses moved in the livery stable 2 buildings over. Men laughed in the saloon across the street, their voices carrying through the thin walls, and she stared at the ceiling and thought about Zachary Morrison's terrible guilty face, and the careful way he had not answered her questions. The money was still in her apron, hanging on the hook by her bed, and she had not deposited it yet with the bank because doing so felt like accepting something she had not earned. But she needed it. God above, she needed it desperately, and the knowledge sat in her stomach like bad meat. She had come to Ogallala believing that independence meant refusing help. That strength was measured by what you could carry alone, and 2 years of slowly drowning had not shaken that conviction. Her aunt had raised her after her parents died of cholera when she was 12, had taught her that a woman needed her own money and her own skills because men were unreliable and the world was hard. Helena had taken those lessons to heart, had saved every penny and learned to bake bread that could have 1 ribbons, and had been so certain that effort would be enough. The town had other ideas. The railroad had other ideas. Economics, she did not fully understand, had other ideas, and now here she was, keeping the ovens lit with money that appeared like magic from a cowboy who could not lie to save his life. She got up before dawn as always, dressed in the dark, and went to start the fires. The ovens were her grandmother's design, brick and iron built to hold heat all day, and she fed them kindling and watched the flames catch while the sky outside went from black to gray. She mixed dough with practiced hands, the rhythm of it soothing in its familiarity, and was shaping loaves when she heard the boots on the walkway. Her heart jumped before she could stop it. He came through the door right on schedule, hat low and eyes careful, and this time she was ready for him. She wiped her hands on her apron and came to the counter, meeting him with a directness that made him slow his approach. "We need to talk," she said before he could ask for his bread. The guilt slammed back into his face like a door. "About what? You know about what?" She kept her voice gentle but firm. "You have been leaving me money, Mr. Morrison. Do not insult me by denying it again." He looked at her for a long moment, something working behind his eyes, and she watched his terrible poker face crumble in real time. His shoulders slumped, his jaw unclenched. He took off his hat and held it in both hands, worrying the brim, and when he spoke his voice was barely above a whisper. "I did not mean any insult by it. I know." And she did, somehow. Whatever this was, it was not condescension, but I need to understand why. "I am not a charity case, Mr. Morrison. I did not ask for help." "I know you did not." He stared at his hat like it might tell him what to say. "You would never ask. You would fail first, lose everything, before you would ask anyone for anything. I have watched you for 2 years running this place on nothing but grit and stubbornness, and it is the damnedest, most frustrating thing I ever saw." The words landed with unexpected force, and Helena felt something shift in her chest. "You have been watching me." His face went red, the color stark against his weathered skin. "Not like that. I just mean I notice things. I noticed when you stopped ordering the good flour and switched to the cheaper kind. I noticed when you started staying open later, trying to catch more customers. I noticed when you began looking tired all the time, like you were carrying the whole world on your back and refusing to set it down." He finally looked up at her, his pale eyes intense. "I notice because I come in here every morning and you are always here, always working, always trying, and I just wanted to help." "But why?" The question felt important, crucial, like everything depended on his answer. "You do not even know me." Something crossed his face then, something raw and vulnerable that made him look younger despite the lines around his eyes. "I know you better than you think," he said quietly. "I know you hum when you think no one is listening. I know you always give the stale bread to the kids who come in instead of throwing it out. I know you work yourself half to death and never complain, and you have a smile for everyone even when I can see you are dying inside from worry." He stopped, swallowed hard. "I know enough." The air in the shop felt too thin. Helena realized her hands were shaking and she pressed them flat on the counter to steady them. "How long?" she asked. "How long have you been leaving the money? Since I heard you tell the grain supplier you needed another week to pay your bill. Since I saw that look on your face like it was killing you to ask for time." His knuckles were white on his hat brim. "I have been riding cattle drives for 15 years, Miss Lawson. I have been saving money because I got no use for it, no family, no ties to anything. It was just sitting in the bank doing nothing, and you were here drowning, and I thought maybe I could help without you knowing, without you feeling beholden or pitied or whatever it is you are feeling right now." She stared at him, this taciturn cowboy she had barely noticed for 2 years, and saw him clearly for the first time. Saw the loneliness in the set of his shoulders, the careful way he held himself apart from the world, the desperate sincerity in his face as he tried to explain something he clearly had no words for. He had fallen for her, she realized with a jolt that went through her like lightning. Somewhere in 2 years of morning bread purchases and careful observation, this hard-shelled man had fallen, and because he did not know how to say it, he had tried to show it the only way he knew how. "You cannot just give me money," she said, but her voice had lost its sharp edge. "That is not how this works. I know." He looked miserable. "I know it was stupid and probably made things worse, but I did not know what else to do. I am not good with words, Miss Lawson. I am not good with people. I can work cattle and I can ride and I can throw a rope, but I cannot walk up to someone and say what I am thinking without feeling like I am going to crawl out of my skin." His eyes met hers again, desperate and honest. "I just wanted to help you keep your dream alive. That is all." Something in Helena's chest cracked open, and she felt the walls she had built around herself shiver and start to crumble. She had been so focused on staying independent, on proving she did not need anyone, that she had never stopped to consider what it might mean to be wanted in spite of that. He had not left the money because he thought her weak or incapable. He had left it because he thought her strong and capable and worth preserving, because watching her struggle had hurt him in some deep, unspoken way, and because he had no other language for caring except this clumsy, secret generosity. "I cannot take your money," she said finally, and watched his face fall. "But not because I do not appreciate it, because it is not fair to you and it does not solve the real problem." She took a breath, steadying herself for what came next. "The bakery is failing, Mr. Morrison. I have been pretending otherwise, but the truth is I cannot compete with the railroad goods, and I do not have enough customers. Your money has bought me time, but it has not bought me a future." He looked at her for a long moment, his expression cycling through sadness and understanding, and finally settling on something that looked almost like hope. "What if there was another way?" he said slowly. "What if it was not charity but something else? Like what?" He worried his hat brim again, clearly wrestling with whatever he was trying to say. "I got money saved up. More than I told you. Enough that I have been thinking about stopping the cattle drives, settling down somewhere permanent. I am 32 years old and I got nothing to show for it except a sore back and a bedroll." He paused, gathering courage. "What if we made it a partnership? You got the skills and the shop, I got the capital. We could expand, maybe add pies or cakes, get more supplies. Do it proper, legal, an actual business arrangement." Helena felt her heart beating very fast. "That is a significant proposition, Mr. Morrison. I know it." He met her eyes, and she saw him lay himself bare in that look. "But I want to be clear about why I am offering. It is not just business sense, though I think we could make it work. It is because I have been half in love with you since about the third time I came in here, and you smiled at me like I was a person worth smiling at instead of just another saddle tramp. It is because watching you pour your heart into this place has been the most beautiful thing I ever saw, and the thought of you losing it makes me feel like someone is taking a knife to my chest." He stopped, his face flushed. "So yes, I am offering a partnership. But I am also saying that I want to be around if you will have me, not just as a silent investor, as someone who cares what happens to you." The words hung in the air between them, raw and honest and terrifying in their vulnerability. Helena stood very still, her mind racing. She thought about pride and independence and all the walls she had built to keep the world at a distance. She thought about 2 years of loneliness disguised as self-sufficiency, and the bone-deep exhaustion of carrying everything alone. She thought about this man who had watched her from a careful distance and tried to help in the only way he could think of, whose terrible poker face betrayed a heart that clearly felt things too deeply to hide. "I do not want to be saved," she said quietly. "I want to be met as an equal. I know." His voice was rough with emotion. "That is what I am offering. A partnership. Your skill and my money, 50-50 split on the profits. You run the baking because you are good at it, and I would probably burn the place down. I handle the books and the ordering and whatever else needs doing. We build something together. Not me rescuing you, but both of us making something that could not exist with just one." She studied his face, looking for any sign of condescension or pity, and found only sincerity and a hope so fragile it made her chest ache. He was offering her exactly what she needed in exactly the way she could accept it, meeting her pride with respect and her independence with partnership. It was terrifying and tempting in equal measure, and her heart was saying yes before her head had fully caught up. "And the other part?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. "The part about caring what happens to me." His face went through another series of expressions, guilt and hope and fear all tangled together. "That is separate from the business," he said carefully. "I will be a partner regardless. But if you might consider, someday, maybe letting me court you proper, I would count myself the luckiest man in Nebraska." He paused. "And if you never want that, if you just want a business partner and nothing more, I can live with it. I just needed you to know." Helena felt herself standing at a crossroads, every choice she made from here determining what shape her life would take. She could refuse, could keep struggling alone until the inevitable end came, could hold on to her pride and her walls and her careful distance from everything that might hurt her. Or she could take the terrifying step of accepting help, of letting someone in, of admitting that maybe strength did not have to mean solitude and independence did not have to mean isolation. "I want to think about it," she said finally. The partnership, I mean. Give me a day to consider the terms, what it would look like legally. But Mr. Morrison, she paused, watching his face carefully, you should know that I have noticed you too. I notice that you come in every morning even though the mercantile is closer. I notice that you are always polite even when you clearly hate small talk. I notice that you look at me sometimes like I am something precious, and it made me feel things I did not have time to examine. She took a breath. So yes, we can discuss a partnership. And yes, you can court me if we can figure out how to separate business from personal without making a mess of both. The hope that lit his face was like sunrise, warming and impossible to look away from. He put his hat back on with unsteady hands, his smile small but genuine. Thank you, he said, his voice thick. I will do right by you, Miss Lawson, on both counts. Helena, she corrected. If we are going to be partners and you are going to court me, you should probably use my given name, Helena. He said it like a prayer, testing the shape of it. Zachary. Or Zach, if you prefer. Zachary suits you. She found herself smiling despite everything, despite the uncertainty and the fear and the massive change that was looming. Come back tomorrow and we will talk terms. And Zachary, he paused at the door, looking back. No more secret money in my flour tin. If we are doing this, we do it honestly. His terrible poker face made another appearance, guilt and humor mixed together. Yes, madam. The negotiations took 3 days and involved a lawyer from the county seat who drew up papers that gave them each 50% ownership of Lawson's Bakery, now amended to Lawson and Morrison Baking Company. Zachary insisted that her name come first since it had been her shop originally. Helena insisted on ironclad language that kept their personal relationship separate from the business, so that if courtship ended badly, they could still function as partners. They signed the papers in the lawyer's office with the autumn sun slanting through dusty windows, and when it was done, Zachary shook her hand with a grip that was firm and warm and spoke of promises made. He was true to his word on both counts. The capital he brought in was substantial, enough that Helena caught her breath when she saw the bank draft. They paid off her debts first, wiping the slate clean, and then began the work of expansion. Zachary had a mind for numbers she had not expected, could calculate costs and margins in his head faster than she could write them down, and his years of trail drives had taught him logistics and planning. They ordered better flour, more sugar, real vanilla extract instead of the synthetic version, and Helena began experimenting with recipes she had not been able to afford before. The courtship proceeded at a pace that felt both glacial and terrifying. Zachary was careful with her in a way that made her heart ache, always respectful, always giving her space to retreat if she needed it. He came in early to help fire the ovens, working in companionable silence while the sky lightened outside. He walked her home after they closed, even though home was just through the back door, and they would stand on her threshold talking about nothing and everything while the stars came out. He was not eloquent, but he was sincere, and Helena found herself watching for him throughout the day, her heart lifting when she heard his boots on the walkway. The first time he kissed her was 2 months after they signed the partnership papers. They were working late, cleaning up after a day of steady customers, and she was wiping down the counter when she turned and found him watching her with that look on his face, the one that said he was feeling things he did not have words for. "What?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious. "You have flour in your hair," he said, his voice soft. "You always have flour in your hair, and I think it might be my favorite thing about you." She laughed, reaching up to brush it away, but he caught her hand. His fingers were warm and calloused and very gentle. "Helena," he said, her name rough in his throat, I know we are taking this slow, but I need you to know that I am all in. On the business, on courting you, on whatever future we might build. I am not going anywhere." Her heart was pounding so hard she thought he must be able to hear it. "I am beginning to understand that," she said quietly. "And Zachary, I think I might be all in too." He leaned in slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and when his lips met hers it was gentle and careful and full of all the things he could not say out loud. She kissed him back, her hands coming up to rest on his chest where she could feel his heart hammering just as hard as hers, and something that had been locked tight in her chest for years finally opened up. When they pulled apart, he was smiling, really smiling, and she realized she had never seen him look so young. "Your poker face is still terrible," she told him, and he laughed, the sound rusty but real. The business thrived in ways neither of them had anticipated. Word spread that the bakery had new ownership and expanded offerings, and customers began coming in from the surrounding ranches and farms. Helena's pies became locally famous, her apple and her cherry causing mild fights over the last slice. Zachary handled the business side with quiet competence, negotiating with suppliers and managing the books while Helena did what she loved. They worked together with an ease that surprised them both, anticipating each other's needs and covering each other's weaknesses. And by spring of 1880, they were profitable enough to hire a part-time assistant. The courtship deepened alongside the business. Zachary took her on a picnic by the Platte River, spreading a blanket on the prairie grass and sharing food she had made while they watched the clouds drift past. She learned that he had been orphaned young, raised by an uncle who worked cattle, and that he had been alone most of his adult life. He learned that she still missed her aunt terribly, that she sometimes woke in the night afraid the shop would be gone, and that letting herself love him was the scariest thing she had ever done. They talked for hours on that blanket, their conversations ranging from the mundane to the profound, and when he took her hand and held it, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. He proposed on a Tuesday morning in late summer while they were prepping for the day. Helena was rolling out dough, and he was supposed to be doing inventory, but when she looked up, she found him standing there with that terrible guilty face on again, like he had been caught at something. "What did you do?" she asked, half amused and half concerned. "I want to marry you," he blurted out, the words tumbling over each other. "I know it has only been a year and maybe that is too fast. But I wake up every morning excited to come here and work beside you, and I go to bed every night wishing I did not have to leave. And I think I have probably known since the day I left that first money in your flour tin that I wanted to spend my life with you." He reached into his pocket with shaking hands and pulled out a ring, simple gold with a small stone. "I am not good with words, and I am probably doing this wrong, but Helena, will you marry me?" She stood there with flour on her hands and her heart in her throat, looking at this man who had somehow become the center of her world without her fully realizing it. He was watching her with his heart in his eyes, vulnerable and hopeful and terrified, and she thought about how far they had both come from that morning when she had confronted him about the money. She thought about the partnership they had built, business and personal, and how he had met her as an equal in every way that mattered. She thought about how he made her laugh and how he understood her silences, and how he had never once made her feel small. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "Yes, I will marry you." The relief and joy on his face was almost too much to bear. He came around the counter in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a fervor that made her dizzy, and when they finally broke apart they were both laughing. "I love you," he said against her hair. "I love you so much it scares me." "I love you too," she whispered back and felt the truth of it settle into her bones. Even when you make terrible decisions about hiding money in flour tins, he groaned, burying his face in her shoulder. You are never going to let me live that down, are you? Never. She pulled back to look at him, her smile wide. It is the story of how we started, how you fell first and I was too stubborn to notice. They were married in October of 1880 in a simple ceremony at the church on 5th Street, with half of Ogallala in attendance and the bakery closed for the day. Helena wore a dress of pale blue that brought out her eyes, and Zachary wore a new suit that made him look uncomfortable and handsome in equal measure. They exchanged vows with hands clasped tight, and when the preacher pronounced them married, Zachary kissed her with a sweetness that made the assembled crowd cheer. They had a reception at the bakery with cakes Helena had made the day before, and they danced in the street while a fiddler played and the sun set over the prairie. They moved into a small house on the edge of town, a frame building with a porch that faced west and enough rooms to grow into. Helena continued running the bakery with Zachary at her side, and their reputation grew until people were coming from as far as Julesburg to buy their goods. They added cookies and pastries to the line, and eventually began supplying the hotels and restaurants along the rail line. The business that had been failing became solid, then successful, then thriving, but the best part for both of them was the partnership, the way they moved through their days as a team. The morning Helena realized she was pregnant, she had been married for just over a year and was kneading dough while Zachary inventoried supplies in the back. The nausea had been bothering her for days, but she had dismissed it as a stomach bug until she counted the weeks and felt her heart skip. She set down the dough with trembling hands and went to find him, discovering him bent over the account books with a pencil behind his ear. "Zachary," she said, and something in her voice made him look up immediately. "What is wrong?" He was on his feet in an instant, crossing to her with concern etched on his face. "Nothing is wrong." She took his hands, squeezing tight. "But I think we might need to convert the spare room sooner than we planned." It took him a moment to understand, and then his eyes went wide and his terrible poker face made one final appearance, cycling through shock and joy and terror in rapid succession. "You are certain?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Fairly certain." She smiled at him, tears gathering in her eyes. "We are going to have a baby, Zachary." He pulled her into his arms so carefully, like she might break, and she felt him shaking. "I am going to be a father," he said into her hair, wonder in his voice. "We are going to be parents." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, despite Helena's initial worry. Zachary became absurdly protective, trying to take over all the heavy work at the bakery until she sat him down and explained that she was pregnant, not fragile, and needed him to stop treating her like glass. He tried, though she caught him hovering more than once, and his concern was so genuine that she could not quite be annoyed. They painted the spare room together on Sundays, discussing names and futures and all the ways their lives were about to change. Helena worked at the bakery until she was 8 months along, finally conceding to stay home only when bending over the counter became genuinely uncomfortable. Their son was born on a bright May morning in 1882, arriving after a labor that was shorter than expected and left Helena exhausted but triumphant. Zachary had paced the parlor while the midwife worked, and when he was finally allowed in to meet his child, he looked like someone had hit him with a hammer. He held the baby with infinite care, his large weathered hands cradling the tiny body, and when he looked up at Helena, his eyes were wet. "He is perfect," Zachary whispered. "You are perfect. I did not know I could feel this much." They named him Nathaniel after Zachary's uncle who had raised him, and the baby was healthy and loud and had his father's eyes. Helena watched Zachary learn to be a father with the same determination he brought to everything else, fumbling through diaper changes and late-night feedings with a sincerity that made her heart swell. He sang to Nathaniel in a rough off-key voice, old trail songs and made-up lullabies, and the baby would quiet in his arms like he knew he was safe. On slow afternoons, they would bring Nathaniel to the bakery, setting his cradle in the back room where Helena could check on him between customers, and the sight of her husband covered in flour and holding their son while explaining the finer points of sourdough to a 3-month-old became one of Helena's favorite memories. The years folded into each other with a contentment that still sometimes took Helena by surprise. The bakery continued to prosper, becoming a cornerstone of Ogallala's small business community. Zachary finally gave up cattle drives entirely, settling into the life of a shopkeeper and family man with an ease that surprised them both. Nathaniel grew into a lively toddler with his father's curiosity and his mother's stubbornness, and the house on the edge of town filled with the sounds of family. On quiet evenings, after Nathaniel was asleep and the bakery was closed for the night, Helena and Zachary would sit on their porch and watch the sun set over the prairie. She would lean against his shoulder, and he would wrap an arm around her waist, and they would talk about the day or the future or nothing at all. Sometimes, Helena would think back to that morning when she had found money in her flour tin for the 3rd time, to the confrontation that had changed everything, and she would smile at how far they had come. "What are you thinking about?" Zachary asked one evening, catching her smile. "You," she said honestly, "and your terrible poker face," he groaned, but he was smiling. "I thought we agreed to never speak of that again." "I agreed to no such thing." She turned to look at him, her eyes soft. "It was the best thing that ever happened to me, you know. Your clumsy attempt to help, your inability to lie worth a damn, all of it." He kissed her temple, his voice warm. "Best thing that ever happened to me too, even if I had to endure constant mockery about my poker skills for the rest of my life." "Especially then," Helena said, and laughed when he tickled her side. Inside, Nathaniel made a sound in his sleep, and they both paused to listen, but he settled again without waking. The prairie stretched out before them in the gathering dark, vast and endless and full of possibility, and Helena thought about roots and choices, and the strange ways that lives could intertwine. She had come to Nebraska seeking independence and found partnership instead, had built walls to protect herself, and discovered that letting them down was not weakness but strength. Zachary's arm tightened around her waist, a gentle pressure that spoke of permanence and promise. Somewhere in town a dog barked. The stars were beginning to appear overhead, pinpricks of light in the darkening sky. The air smelled like grass and dust and the approaching summer, and Helena breathed it in deeply, committing this moment to memory. This perfect ordinary moment, where she sat on a porch with the man she loved and their son sleeping inside and a business they had built together thriving in the center of town. "I am glad you are a terrible liar," she said softly. "Me too," Zachary replied and pulled her closer. "Me too." Years passed with the steady rhythm of seasons, and the Morrison family became as much a part of Ogallala as the railroad tracks that ran through its heart. The bakery expanded twice more, eventually taking over the adjacent building and hiring a full staff of assistants. Helena's recipes became treasured across Nebraska, written down and shared and adapted, and people came from increasing distances to buy from Lawson and Morrison Baking Company. The business that had almost failed became a legacy, something to pass down, and Helena and Zachary worked side by side through it all. Nathaniel grew tall and serious, inheriting his father's quiet nature and his mother's work ethic. By the time he was 10, He was helping in the bakery on weekends, learning the trade with the same determination his mother had shown. He would stand on a stool to reach the counter, his small hands kneading dough while Helena instructed, and Zachary looked on with unmistakable pride. The boy loved the business the way his mother did, could already tell good flour from bad by feel, and Helena and Zachary exchanged glances over his head that spoke of futures taking shape. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Zachary closed the bakery for the day and took Helena back to the spot by the Platte River where they had picnicked during their courtship. They spread a blanket on the prairie grass that was now familiar, sharing food and watching Nathaniel wade in the shallows catching frogs. Helena was 40 now, her hair showing the first threads of gray, and Zachary's face had deepened with lines. But when he looked at her, she saw the same expression he had worn that morning. She confronted him about the money. Wonder and love and a terrible inability to hide either. "Do you remember when you asked me why?" she said, lying back on the blanket and watching clouds drift overhead. "Why I would leave money, I remember." He stretched out beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "I remember thinking I was going to die of embarrassment right there in your shop. You should have." She smiled at the memory. "Your face was a disaster. I have never seen anyone look more guilty." "I was trying so hard to be subtle," Zachary said, his voice rich with humor. "I thought if I just left it without saying anything, you could keep your pride and I could help and nobody would have to have uncomfortable conversations. And instead we had the most uncomfortable conversation possible. Worth it, though." He rolled onto his side to look at her properly. Every moment of mortification was worth getting here. Helena turned her head to meet his eyes, her heart swelling with the same fierce love she had felt on their wedding day and every day since. "I love you," she said simply. "I loved you when I was too proud to admit it, and I love you now, and I will love you when we are both too old to lift a sack of flour. I love you too." He leaned in to kiss her, gentle and sweet, and Nathaniel made a disgusted sound from the river that made them both laugh. "Even when you mock my poker face. Especially then." The sun moved across the sky and they lay together on the blanket, Nathaniel's laughter carrying on the wind, and Helena thought about the story they were writing with their lives. It was not the story she had imagined when she first came to Nebraska, was not about solitary success or proving herself alone, but it was better. It was about partnership and love and the courage to let someone in. It was about a cowboy with a terrible poker face and a woman too stubborn to fail, and the way they had found each other in a failing bakery on a dusty street. She reached for Zachary's hand and laced their fingers together, and he squeezed back with a pressure that said everything words could not. They had built a life, a business, a family. They had taken a foundation of flour dust and secret charity and transformed it into something solid and lasting. And every morning when Helena walked into the bakery they owned together, when she saw Zachary already there with the ovens fired and coffee brewing, she thought about how sometimes the best things in life came from letting go of pride and accepting help and trusting that not everyone who offered kindness had ulterior motives. Though Zachary's motives, she had to admit, had been pretty clearly written all over his face. "What are you smiling about now?" he asked, catching her expression. "You," she said again, "because it was always you. And terrible poker faces and money in flour tins, and the fact that I almost threw you out of my shop that morning. I am very glad you did not." His thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. "That would have made the last 10 years significantly more complicated. For you, maybe." "I would have been fine," he laughed, the sound warm and familiar. "Liar, you would have worked yourself into an early grave." "Probably," Helena admitted, "but I would have gone down with my pride intact. Your pride, maybe, but not your happiness." He said it gently, without judgment. "I think we both needed each other, Helena. You needed help whether you would admit it or not, and I needed someone to help, needed a purpose beyond drifting from drive to drive. We saved each other, I think." She considered that, watching Nathaniel splash in the river and feeling the warm, solid presence of her husband beside her. "You are right," she said finally. "We did save each other, in the best possible way." The sun continued its arc toward the horizon, painting the sky in colors that shifted from blue to gold to rose. They stayed by the river until Nathaniel complained of hunger, then packed up the blanket and walked back to town together, their son running ahead while they followed hand in hand. The house waited for them on the edge of Ogallala, warm and welcoming with lamplight glowing in the windows, and the bakery stood on Main Street with their names above the door. It was a good life, an imperfect life, a life built on flour dust and honesty and the determined love of two people who had chosen each other against all odds. That night, after Nathaniel was asleep and the house was quiet, Helena stood at the kitchen counter measuring flour for the next day's baking. It was an old habit, preparing the night before, and her hands moved with the automatic precision of decades of practice. She reached for the flour tin, the same one she had opened so many years ago to find mysterious money, and smiled at the memory. The tin was different now, replaced and replaced again as they went through supplies, but the echo of that morning remained. Zachary came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "Still checking for secret money," he teased, "always." She leaned back against him, solid and warm and home. "Though I think my days of mysterious benefactors are behind me. Probably for the best. I do not think I could pull off the subterfuge again even if I wanted to. Your poker face has not improved with age, I take it, not even slightly." He kissed the side of her neck. "But I do not need it anymore. I can just tell you things now, like a normal person. It is remarkably easier." Helena turned in his arms to face him, her flour-dusted hands coming up to frame his face. In the lamplight, he looked exactly like himself, weathered and honest and incapable of hiding what he felt, and she loved him so completely, it still sometimes took her breath away. "Thank you," she said softly. "For the money all those years ago, for being stubborn enough to help even when I made it difficult, for loving me before I was ready to be loved." His eyes went soft, that winter sky blue that had watched her for years before she noticed. "Thank you for letting me," he said, "for taking the risk, for building this with me." They stood there in the quiet kitchen, holding each other while the flour tin sat forgotten on the counter and the house settled around them. Outside, Ogallala slept under a blanket of stars, the railroad silent until morning and the prairie stretching away in all directions. It was 1890 now, a new decade approaching, and the world was changing in ways both small and large. But here, in this moment, everything was exactly as it should be. Helena kissed her husband, tasting coffee and contentment, and thought about the story she would tell Nathaniel someday when he was old enough to understand. The story of how his father had fallen in love and been incapable of hiding it, how his terrible poker face had given him away, how his clumsy attempt at helping had turned into a partnership that built a business and a family. It was a good story, a true story, and it had a happy ending. The best kind of story, Helena thought as Zachary held her close, was the kind where everyone got what they needed even if it was not what they expected. She had wanted independence and gotten partnership instead. Zachary had wanted to help and found love. And together, they had created something that was more than the sum of its parts, something that would outlast them both. "Come to bed," Zachary murmured against her hair. "The flour will still be here in the morning." "So will you," Helena said, smiling. "Always." They left the kitchen hand in hand, blowing out lamps as they went, and the house fell into darkness behind them. In the morning they would wake before dawn as always, would fire the ovens and mix the dough and open the shop to whatever the day brought. Nathaniel would help before school, serious and careful with his tasks, and customers would come and go with familiar faces and familiar orders. It was routine and it was precious, and Helena would not trade it for anything. But for now, in the quiet dark with her husband's hand in hers and their son sleeping down the hall, and the whole future spread before them like the prairie under stars, Helena just walked toward their bedroom and felt grateful. Grateful for money hidden in flour tins and terrible poker faces, and the courage to accept help when she needed it most. Grateful for partnerships that became love and love that became family. Grateful for every moment that had led her here, to this life, to this man, to this story that was still being written one day at a time. And if sometimes, in the early morning when she was alone in the bakery, she checked the flour tin just in case, well, that was nobody's business but her own. Some habits died hard, but Zachary never left her secret money again. He did not need to. He was right there beside her instead, exactly where he belonged, with his terrible poker face and his generous heart and his steady, unwavering love. And that, Helena thought, was worth more than all the hidden money in the world.